I hope, good morning everyone. I hope everyone's still awake with me. Anyway, so my name is actually, you can call me Shamila by my middle name. And I'm actually a Brunei student doing my master's in Recalibrating. And I'm under the guidance of my professor, Hanif Park. So actually this is one of my first research papers ever done. So my advocacy or awareness of the issue is pretty new, about 2 years from now. So excuse me if for my lack of knowledge or something like that. Yeah. Anyways, continuing on. So my research is called Neighbor News Analysis and the Korean representation of issue between Palestine and Israel. So as stated, it's just the analysis of the neighbor news here, which is the main portal of news outlets for all the, like, it's a portal where they combine most of the broadcasters and news outlets. It's like a very concise portal here. So that's where they mostly access their news here, and that's where I will be analyzing. Yeah, so it's the basis of my research, which actually it was already published under the Journal of Contemporary Eastern Asia. So, I mean, as I think everyone knows about the issue right now, it's not resolved yet for a lot of years. So my start of the research is based on the military escalation, especially from October 2023. And the reason I chose this topic is because I realized that it's underrepresented even in general, but more so in South Korea. And there's a lot of media representation, and it particularly piqued my interest in the past few years because from the rise of, like, since October 2023, there's a lot of internet discourse of this issue, especially with the use of hashtags like Free Palestine and Stand with Palestine. So my focus is mostly on the online platforms, and like my paper is based off quantitative analysis. Yeah, so because of that, there's a whole global discourse through the hashtags, and the public sentiment about this issue has been evolved, especially with the use of social media. Yeah, so I just want to clarify that the Korean media representation of my paper refers to the domestically produced news outlets in South Korea, especially published on Never News. So it includes broadcasters like KBS, SBS, and NBC, which are the very popular news broadcasters here in Korea, as well as the newspapers like Yonhap News Agency, Joseon, and Hankyor. And these outlets are very, very popular, so they generally shape the domestic public discourse and the report on international issues like the conflict. And actually, most of these news outlets are published in Korean, so I had to translate like all the Korean info into English. It's okay. Anyways, so the theoretical framework that I use is that the media representation of how they construct narratives and frame events and shape perspectives, and especially with the use of neighbor as the news aggregator. And what I use is critical discourse analysis to explore power, ideology, and language in media, as well as content analysis to identify themes, framing, and key actors and sentiment over time. Yeah, so this is why I chose particularly this issue is because there's a lack of analysis in Korean media representation. From my research per se, like there's always a lot of qualitative analysis, but not so much as quantitative. Yeah, so my general question for the paper is, what is the outlook of this issue in Korea, and what has changed since the escalation and over time, as particularly like within the 6-month period, because that is my focus of the research. And how I collected my data is using web crawling, because under my professor we focus on big data and webometrics rather than quantitative analysis. And I chose the time frame between October 5, 2023 and April 4, 2024 because to encapsulate the initial media reactions during the Hamas attack in October 7 and the evolving narratives over a 6-month period. So why they were in Korea over down? Like there's actually two main news article outlets or portals actually, but Naver is the most commonly used one, and it plays a central role in shaping news framing and visibility, especially through their algorithm curation, and they have a specific ranking system that makes the popular ones, the famous ones, more visible than the less famous ones. And yeah, so according to the user preferences and platform algorithms, these will shape their public exposure to the news. And they have a preference to local news like Naver compared to Wikipedia. I think it's largely because of the language as well. But continuing on, so my focus is of analysis is how these media outlets frame the whole issue using their language, themes, and sentiments. And we actually pre-process the data using Python, and like I have to manually clean up the unstructured data as well. But mainly my analysis is using semantic network analysis as well as sentiment analysis. Yeah, so I visualize the data according to monthly trends and according to the sentiment scores, the keyword frequency using word clouds, and I compare it monthly so that you can see how it revolves over time. Because it was pretty obvious when I look at the data. Yeah. So first of all, word frequency. The most frequent term is Israel, and the next one is Hamas and Palestine. So this combination of words reflects an imbalance in narrative focus, which is tied to military escalation by Israel. Like, for some reason, like I put my keywords with Palestine, Gaza, and Israel. But the most common ones were Israel and Hamas over Palestine, which was very interesting to me. And particularly from my data, the very interesting point is that they are targeting of journalists. Like the word journalist appeared a significant amount of times, and I think it's because over that period of time there were a lot of journalists being targeted more than like actual civilians or even Hamas itself. And other high frequency terms are like China, USA in industry, and ceasefire. And as mentioned earlier, because China is portrayed as a peace promoting actor, and they balance their economic ties with Israel, and they put a neutral stance on Palestine. And then in terms of word pairs, I based it on undirected frequency counts, and the word, pretty obvious that the word Israel and Palestine appeared a lot of times, but what's really interesting is that most of the word pairs associated with Israel is involved with negative sentiment terms like war, attack, so these frequent pairing reflects an ongoing violence and military aggression, especially by the Israeli forces. And though it's not as less frequent, it is still significant that these word pairs, some word pairs signify Jewish sentiment as well, like Jews with Palestine and Jews with Israel. And this is the Jesse visualization of the word pairs. Yeah, as you can see, like with the very thicker lines, the Israel/attack, Israel with the word attack. I can't really see it. I can't really find it, but it is there. And you can see that these connections is seen that Israel is seen as the aggressor here, and the word Hamas ceasefire is seen as the negotiation actor, and other central notes like war, USA, China, and Palestine are also connected because of their involvement. So these geopolitical framing and conflict roles, are indicated in the media narratives. And this is the word cloud visualizations. So this on the left is the first month from October 5 to November 4, and the one on the right is the last month, which is March 5, 2024 to April 4, 2024. If you can see that the word Israel and Palestine and Hamas are very visible in the first one, but over time, the involvement of other countries like USA, China, and like prime minister or government are more involved. So in this case, there's a less focus on the actual Palestine people, rather than there's less focus on them, more focus on like other peace mediators and actors. So in this case, like there's a very skewed media representation in Korean and global media. They focus more on Israel and its geopolitical ties, like the USA and the Palestinian casualties, and there's an obvious consistent global media bias that frames Israel more favorably while marginalizing the Palestinian narrative. And I also analyzed sentiment through news outlets and articles. So this is the top 5 articles with positive sentiment. What I analyzed is that the common themes are international relations, diplomacy, stock market, commentary, and Middle East conflict. What's pretty interesting to me is that the top sentiment score, as published by the less popular news outlets here, like I mentioned earlier on that like 중앙일보 or KBS, SBS are the more popular ones, but they do not score a higher positive sentiment, neither negative sentiment like the next slide. So I'll put that conclusion at the end, but yeah, so basically it highlights that from the top scoring article is that it highlights more on international news, and it highlights humanitarian crisis in Gaza and China's diplomatic leadership. And this is the top 5 articles with negative sentiment. The common themes is also Middle East conflict, refugee crisis, humanitarian suffering, and media critique. But the ones that I would like to highlight is that the most negative scoring articles is on the 2023 December 27th, is that it condemns the Israeli bombings in Gaza, and it critiques international silence, supports the BDS movement. And in March 29, 2024, they discuss about the refugee children, and it calls out South Korea's reluctance to accept refugees. Yeah, so these are the top 3 news outlets that was mentioned in the most negative and most positive sentiments. So People's Daily, but like in Korea edition, is because actually People's Daily is a Chinese paper, but like they have a Korean edition that they translate their info into Korean, and it's mostly aligning with pro-Palestinian views in international forums, and it opposes the U.S. And Israeli military actions, and it promotes diplomacy and two-state solution. Whereas KP News, it's more business focused, it's more economic, and they have a tendency to be slightly pro-Israel. And Catholic News, it's more humanitarian, they're more emphasizing on Catholic values like justice, peace, and they really focus on Palestinian civilian suffering and the refugee rights. So if you just look from like People's Daily and compared to Catholic News, they're on the other very end of the extremes, where they represent like diplomatic, political versus humanitarian moral. And like in general, the overall insights that I gather is that mainstream Korean media is generally neutral, like the more popular. popular ones. But the niche outlets like these three, they offer more emotionally charged perspectives. And it reveals like segmented media consumption and ideological diversity in South Korea's news. And I also analyzed the representation of in Korean media. I gathered a total of 390 news agencies that covered Palestine during the study period, and the top three outlets are actually Yonhap News Agency, News One, and Newsys. They're pretty popular in their ranking, but as I said, they don't really represent, like, they're more neutral in their representation of any issue. And so, like, I feel like personally they don't really give a much much impact in the discourse of this issue in Korea. And so obviously there's a gap in representation because none of the top volume outlets were among those with high sentiment polarity, and it reflects a gap between quantity and influence. So, and additionally to that, there's an algorithmic filtering in media bias because obviously the more popular ones, they'll just maintain neutrality to maintain that popularity. Yeah, so there's the difference between mainstream and niche outlets. Like mainstream outlets like Yonhap and Jungang-ilbo, they provide fact-based and neutral coverage, but niche outlets like the top three earlier, they offer more editorial viewpoints. So in this case, they have a broader media implication in general in Korea. They have, like, internationally, they show coverage of like balance, but in Korea, it's quite lax. So I like to underline that there's a need for critical media literacy and content analysis to understand more about this issue. Yeah, so in conclusion, my key finding is that the study analyzed that neighbor news coverage of this issue is that mainstream outlets, they publish high volume but less emotionally impactful content, whereas smaller independent outlets, they produce more polarized content but it's less viewed. And there's an obvious bias in issue representation because over time the coverage of this issue in Korean media skews towards Israel, Hamas, and the US compared to like the actual humanitarian casualties in